Thanks for joining us, John. Appreciate it. So let's start off the same way, if you don't mind. Rockstar wasn't your first job out of high school or college.
Right.
So how did you get started in intellectual property?
I think, Phil talked about the meandering path. I think that's a fair way of characterizing it. I was an Army ROTC undergrad, so my first job out of college was an Army officer. Got out of the Army, was married, and left to be a civilian, and was working for a defense contractor, and started going to school at night. I got an MBA at night, and when I was finishing up my MBA, I remember being unfulfilled because I was working as sort of a manager in the defense contractor, and I felt that the MBA didn't really open any doors. It was kind of weird. So I said, well, gee, let me take the LSATs just sort of on a whim to see how I did, and I did really, really well. And the engineer in me looked at the data and said, well, shit, you have no choice. You have to go to law school. So I went to law school, and my MBA was at GW. My law degree was at University of Maryland, which was why did I pick University of Maryland? Because classes didn't start till 6:30 at night, and I could work a full-time job and then start law school. So it wasn't like this. I think there's more people probably in the patent law space in particular that just sort of meander here somehow. And then when I graduated from law school, it wasn't like while I was in law school I thought I was going to be a patent lawyer. Phil dated himself, I'll date myself. When I left law school, I could have worked for a corporate law firm making $50,000 a year, or a patent law firm making $70,000 a year. And again, I had by that time I had not just a wife but a kid, and okay, I'll do the patent law thing. So I went to work for a patent law firm in DC. Foley & Lardner is the name of the firm, and I was in their DC office. Worked there for a few years, and in 1996, after I'd been there for a while and got comfortable that I knew the patent game, an outfit called Lucent was spinning out of AT&T, and where I got my EE degree, we had a lot of Bell Labs people that were teachers. So and growing up in the New York area, obviously back then you have a lot of respect for Bell Labs.
Sure.
So I remember thinking Bell Labs unplugged from AT&T. Wow, that's a really cool thing. I don't have any money to invest in it, but I have a career to invest in it. So I'm going to look into going in-house. And for any of you guys who are thinking about law firms, it's almost like working for private equity. You go there the first few years, you're grinded because you're working long hours. So you're always trying balancing, do I want to be a family person and whatever, or do I want to sit here and just be ground up? And that just turned out that it was at the time that I had the level of expertise to be comfortable moving across the transom was also the time that one of the best opportunities to go in-house came up. So that's when I jumped to Lucent, which they ended up assigning me to the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania, which is where they make their integrated circuits. This is 1996, and nowadays anybody studies high tech, there's very few integrated circuits that are manufactured in the United States, but back then Lucent Microelectronics, which became later Agere Systems, and then became a bunch of different companies along the way. We had 3 shifts a day of semiconductor manufacturing in our fab, union workers. We grew our own silicon. It was, it's amazing to think that it wasn't that long ago that we did all that kind of stuff in the States.
And you were on the IP side there as well?
Yeah, so started out kind of like when I go back to Foley & Lardner. My early IP jobs was helping people get patents. So I had a lot of experience working with inventors. And when you talk about small startups, even in Marquee and now with our new entity, it's kind of circled back that a lot of our work is working with small companies that don't have the wherewithal to know what they should be doing about patents, but they have, in some cases they have lots of capital, but they're focused on the product. And even back then, we would help people get their patents. When I joined Lucent, I was working with the inventors, the Bell Labs inventors, to help them patent their inventions. And over time, shifted more and more into the business side. So when Agere Systems spun out of Lucent, it was basically the microelectronics business of a vertically integrated company spinning out so we could sell chips not just into our other sister companies to put into Lucent equipment, but also sell them to Cisco and sell them to other competitors. So that semiconductor business when I was part of that business, I got more involved in the licensing of patents and eventually became the guy running the business. So we were in the mid 2000s, we were making like $150 million a year of licensing revenue on our semiconductors. And when I left Agir to join Nortel, that was in 2008. And basically I was recruited because the business I was running, Nortel didn't have a business like that. Nortel looked at its various competitors, Ericsson, Nokia, whoever they thought were their peer group, and said every one of these other companies has meaningful revenue that flows to the bottom line, very high margin based on licensing out their IP. Nortel was like the Bell Labs of Canada, also created a very, very big portfolio, but had never done that. And as they were trying to do a turnaround, they said, we need to have somebody come in and do that for us. And they recruited me, and I, after doing my due diligence, thought it was an opportunity of a lifetime. So just made the switch and went up to Nortel.
So that's interesting. I mean, Nortel, it's a sort of a sad story for the company. Obviously, it was an amazing company. How many employees did it have at its peak?
100,000.
100,000 employees, and very quickly fell on hard times. It sounds like you joined during that shift.
Well,
is that right?
Not knowing. So I joined. Mike Zafarowski came in from Motorola, previously GE, to turn the company around. And part of the sales pitch to me was, you can be part of our leadership team as we turn this company around. Look at what the public markets are valuing us relative to our sales compared to our peer groups. If we just get our act together, there's lots of profit you're going to be able to make if you come in and get equity now, and you could be part of the turnaround team. So it all made lots of sense just from the corporate side. What the thing that made a ton of sense to me was the patent portfolio that was there, that it was a Bell Labs quality portfolio that had not been used the way Ericsson's and Nokia's had. So it was kind of fertile ground to just come in and run my own business. And that to me was the most exciting part of it.
Right. So we talk in the class in earlier sessions about how patents have a variety of different uses. They can be used defensively in case you get countersued. They can be used offensively to keep your competitors out of the market. They can be used as you can monetize them through litigation or through licensing. But that they're very expensive. $25,000, $50,000, $100,000 per patent, just round numbers. So Nortel, at the time you came in, the portfolio was something like 7,000 patents?
More like 10,000.
10,000 patents.
Yeah.
And yet it sounds like the company hadn't been actively trying to make money out of them and
Right.
hadn't launched litigations to keep competitors out of the market.
Extremely few. And that's one of the questions I know you had on your list of things you might ask me is Kodak versus Nortel. And I think the way I'd answer that is, let's just assume that Phil and Ian were both Nobel Prize winning inventors, and they each came up with a really, really fantastic patent. And both patents were beautiful. They were written well, they had really, really solid claims. And I looked at one and said, this one is worth $100 million, and this one is worth $1,000. How could I possibly come to that conclusion? I don't know if anybody has a guess as to why, but the reason is when you go onto like Google Patents or the USPTO and you search a patent, you see everything I just described. You see the description of the invention, you see the claims, all the stuff that's people think of when they think of a patent. What you don't see is who's licensed to the patent. What are the encumbrances? And that's the most important part. If you have a really fantastic patent, but everybody who might ever use that patent has already got a license to it, which they might have paid for, then the patent is absolutely worthless. So I think of a patent as like its own little micro balance sheet, that it's got a bunch of potential energy in terms of who might be using it that could, if they're using it, they should pay a license fee for. But as you license them, that potential energy becomes kinetic energy in exchange for cash. So in Nortel's case, the patent portfolio was almost all potential energy. And I was comparing it and contrasting it to Lucent and places I'd worked before, where when I would do a license negotiation at Agir, we would be sitting there engaging with some company in Asia, for example, like UMC or Sony or Toshiba or whatever. And as we're gearing up for our new negotiation, a meaningful part of our effort would be, well, which products are they selling and which patents are those products infringing? And let's reverse engineer the products and let's figure out our strategic assertion. But almost as much time and effort would be, well, there's the agreement we did 5 years ago, and then there's one Lucent did, and then one AT&T did, and they've all had different provisions, and it's a complete mess and soup. And oh, by the way, they bought this business, which they came from these other guys, and those guys had a license from AT&T. So figuring out who's actually licensed and how much they're licensed to, when you're at the end of the chain of a company like that that's been actively licensing for a long time, it gets very, very complicated. So as running the business, I had already articulated in my mind and to others, it'd be nice to be able to just etch-a-sketch these stupid licenses away and start all over again. It would be great if I could do that. And then out of the blue, this Nortel thing comes up. And I was like, holy moly, that's the opportunity I've been looking for, because it's Bell Labs quality patents where they weren't etch-a-sketched away, but essentially those guys they're Canadian, so they're nice. I don't know if anybody here's Canadian. So they don't
We're all feeling that these days.
They don't like to poke people in the eye, just because, unless they're playing hockey, they're like the nicest people in the world. And when you build a business plan, I imagine if you ask Phil about his business plan, or Ian about any business plans he's involved, or even Garrett if he's been involved with businesses, we tend to think the US, the big three in Europe, and Asia. And sometimes we just forget Canada's even there. And it's almost like when you look at the weather map and you see the storm coming, and then it just stops at Canada. I know that bugs my wife, because we love Ottawa and Canada now that I've been doing the Nortel thing. But it's like we just forget about them. So the Canadians weren't poking people in the eye, and nobody was approaching them. And you have decades of high quality R&D that's yielding patent portfolios, and nothing's happening with them.
Let me stick on that for 1 second. So, because I think that's a great start to the story, and it's a really interesting differentiation. We'll come back and talk about the Kodak sale and the Nortel sale in a moment. But what was Nortel's plan? I mean, I can imagine if you weren't monetizing them and you weren't keeping people out of the market, that you could rationally end up at a strategy where you filed some patents. How did they end up with 10,000 patents?
Well, Nortel was probably more, I don't even know if this is a real word, a macrocosm of what most companies are today that are littler companies. They get patents not because they're thinking of the business of patents, they get patents because they're kind of validating trophies to prove to ourselves that we've actually done something innovative. And our engineers expect, when they're doing something cool, that we're going to file for a patent, and then they get a plaque. And more often than not, I'm saying nobody, this is the 90% of companies, aren't thinking about the patent as a monetizable thing, or a hedge, as Phil was describing it, or as we tell them, I know you have these great plans, but assume you're going to get screwed by those guys. And if you're going to get screwed by them, the only thing you talk about David and Goliath, I can't answer the question about how David fights Goliath, but David has a much better chance if he's got patents than if he doesn't. If he doesn't have patents, he doesn't have any chance at all. So get them and develop them. That's what we help people do, to develop them so that they're at least as strong as potential weapon. And even though patents might be weaker now, as Quozo didn't help us make them stronger, as weaker now than they've have in the past, the pendulum will swing back and they'll become stronger again. So get them, because you have to be smart about it, but you don't have any chance without that playing field being leveled with the patents.
Yeah, got it. Okay, so you're at the company. There's the bank. Nortel is in financial trouble.
So yeah,
the decision gets made to carve off these patents.
Right. Well, let's put a time. I don't know. Is anybody here 22 years old? Out of curiosity, around 22.
Or less.
22. You're not 22. All right. So you could be the proxy for my daughter at that point in time. It's summer of 2008, and Christina is going to be a senior in high school. She has an older brother who's a junior, and she has two younger brothers that are in elementary school. And she's lived in the same house since she was 2 years old. All she cares about is she going to be able to play with the varsity soccer team or JV when she gets to high school. And Dad comes back and says, oh, guess what? We're going to move to Ottawa or Texas because of this really, really great opportunity. Nortel didn't. The plan was we were going to monetize these patents and we were going to build a business, and I was going to be generating hundreds of millions of dollars a year that they hadn't had before. And that was the summer of 2008. And anybody who's seen The Big Short knows that in September of 2008, everything got upended. Nortel was highly leveraged and could not get through the liquidity crisis. Once the liquidity market seized up, and they couldn't continue to survive, they believed. Now, Nortel filed for bankruptcy. Everyone here knows Nortel filed for bankruptcy now that we've talked about it, but I would challenge anybody here to actually make a case that Nortel was really bankrupt, because I don't think Nortel was really bankrupt. And that's one of the, again, if people want to do some research or think about it, one of the funny things about it is if you look at bankruptcy, the general theory is you're bankrupt if your debts exceed your assets, that you owe people more money than you have, then you're bankrupt. Well, Nortel thought they were bankrupt, because they didn't know their patents were worth $4.5 billion. If they knew their patents were $4.5 billion, they weren't close to bankrupt. They had a couple billion dollars in cash, and they had a whole bunch of debts. They had a debt payment coming up. So there was no plan to sell the patents. The plan was we're going to build a business, and in the middle of all of that, the liquidity crisis hits, and then we end up going bankrupt, and then we end up having to liquidate. When we liquidated, they discovered, based on the work my team and I did, that these patents are really worth a ton of money. But if you go to the early days of the bankruptcy, the really smart bankers like Lazard here, I'm not sure if S&C was involved in supporting any of the guys in the bankruptcy, but the smart people thought the patents were worthless. And I say it may be more worth less than worthless, but worth very little. And their goal was to sell these businesses. We sold the business to Ciena, we sold the business to Avaya, we sold the business to Ericsson, a couple other smaller businesses. Their goal was to sell these businesses. And when my team and I would say, well, wait a minute, these patents are really valuable, they almost said, well, go back in your corner with your propeller head, don't bother us, because we want to sell these businesses almost like a real estate agent. You want to make your fee, move on to the next deal. They're really not, if your real estate agent tells you they're trying to get you the maximum amount of money for your house, that's really not true. They're trying to get as many sales as they can. And if you want max dollars, you're almost like in tension with them. Same way with, I think, the investment banking community. They wanted to do the deal, and we're fighting them to say, no, these patents are really valuable. And eventually, we convinced enough people through the process, and that led to us keeping most of the patents back. So when you asked how many there were 10,000 or so. We then, through our process, allocated certain patents to each of the businesses that were sold. That led to 6,000 that stayed with the company. And then after all the different businesses were sold for $3.2 billion, we then held the auction that sold the remaining patent portfolio for $4.5 billion.
So let's touch on what that fascinating auction.
Yes.
Fascinating for a whole bunch of reasons. But if we could go back to the 3 months before the auction happened, let's say.
Okay. Google would be the stalking horse at that point.
Yeah. So you had the idea. Was you were involved in these discussions? Probably pretty. It sounds like you were driving many of the discussions.
Well, we drove the decision that we had to treat the patents as a separate asset. Yep. But once we started, when we sold the business to Ericsson or the business to Ciena, my team and I would be at the big table because we would be doing the IP component of that transaction. Once we were selling the IP and my team, we were the green team that was being sold. So we were a little more moved to the other table. Okay. So they were there. We're in the room all the time, but we're not necessarily the decision makers at that point.
So if you can say, at the moment when this was happening and Google came in as a stalking horse.
Correct.
And so what that means is basically Google was going to put in the first bid, and you knew that Google was sort of committed to bid.
$900 million was their bid.
Which is not a small amount of money. If you can say, did you have a sense that you must have had a prediction of what that auction, where the ball would stop?
So the pre-argument to that is the argument we had with Lazard, where we were saying, and others, that we were saying the patents were worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And Lazard saying, come on, it's a pile of paper. How could it be worth hundreds of millions of dollars? And we said, well, it's at least worth as much as some of these other businesses you're selling. And there was a debate within the estate, and it's a complicated estate because you've got Canadian, US, and UK participants. So probably almost as many people in this room were involved in the conversation to get consensus as to what we were going to do with the IP. Some people, and I was aligned with this, some people thought if we're not going to get a real big pile of money for these patents, we as the estate should emerge from bankruptcy as just a licensing business. And what I became as Rockstar, I would have been as Nortel, which would have been better. The whole story would have been much, much better if we'd done that. And the reason why some people thought that is they were representing creditors who were looking for money over time. And the alignment of the money they're looking for over time is almost exactly what a patent licensing business does anyway. So they don't really need a big pile of money now. They just want to have this, they could have this ongoing business. Others, of course, just wanted to make the sale, get their fee, and move on. And there was a debate because we didn't know what we would actually get for the patents, probably 6 months before. We never really identified the line across which we will sell. But once Google came in as a stalking horse at $900 million, nobody argued we weren't across that line. Because all the other businesses, the highest stalking horse bid we had for anything else was $650 million that Nokia Siemens did for the business that Ericsson bought. So once Google came in at the highest stalking horse bid, it was like, okay, it's out of our control. There's no way we're going to be able to emerge from bankruptcy. We're going to sell.
Sure. And the 900, at that point, you had said it's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. 900 must have been a bit of a happy moment just there.
Absolutely, it's validating for sure.
Yeah.
Validated to my team and I. And what was cool about our team is that the team that I had built with when I joined Nortel, they were getting questions from their friends a couple years earlier during bankruptcy. Why are you part of this IP group? You should come join us at Ericsson or join us at Ciena. What we're doing, and then they found themselves fast forward a few years later, and the same people are thanking them at soccer games for saving their pensions. What you guys did was really great. And so it's pretty cool the way that worked out. But yeah, there was a bit of and still is. I mean, our team at Marquee, that's now part of Hilco, kind of a band of brothers sort of feeling that we fought the good fight together, and on behalf of the creditors, which is largely the pension funds, we did a really great job. And that, yeah, $900 million, it was very satisfying. And then you start thinking, as you're saying, well, where can this go? Right. And when you get into the auction, I know we have to get other people up on the stage, but the auction was kind of fascinating because, why did Google had bid the Miesel-Mertens constant, Bruns constant, pi, and then as they're doing this, I'm thinking, okay, you're the stalking horse bidder. You have all the money in the world. You're gonna win this at some point.
But actually, by the way, what John's I mentioned this in the first class, but Google was bidding in mathematical jokes, basically the whole way through. And they were bidding against, this wasn't a mom and pop shop. They were bidding against a coalition that included Apple, Microsoft.
Well, at the first stages, and this is all public record, so you guys could go look up the transcript. At the first stages, Intel was bidding separately, Apple was bidding separately, Google was bidding separately, and there were these Rockstar, Microsoft, Sony, Ericsson, and BlackBerry were bidding separately. So later on, they got combined, where the Intel guys and Google guys teamed up, and Apple joined the rest of the Rockstars. But when Google made its first irrational number bid, it was either the Miesel-Mertens constant or the Bruns constant. It was one of the two, and Intel was at that point in time the winning bidder, and it was a backwards joke at Intel because supposedly when they made the Pentium something, they had a heating problem that was related to them screwing up on that constant. And I remember Jillian describing it to me almost like the Hubble telescopes thing, kind of thing, that they and only Google knew it. But when Jillian, my CTO, when she saw that, she goes, you know why? That's right away. She knew which constant it was, and she knew why the hell they were doing it. And it's anybody, Jillian, she's an amazing person. But and then they bid. The Bruns constant was being with a 2 or 3, I remember, and then they did pi. And I remember talking to them during the breaks in the action, and I had shown them I forget the number, but I put Google in my calculator and turned it upside down. I was trying to encourage them to bid that. I think 3.7 billion. But I was thinking Avogadro's number, which is 6, was in the running. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, after playing these games, making you think that, wake me up when this gets interesting, all of a sudden they bid 4.4. The Rockstar guys bid 4.5, and they say, okay, we're done. And that blew me away that they did. I was sure that they were going to keep going, but at some point, as you're doing $100 million bid increments, they become smaller and smaller percentages of the principal number you're bidding over. So then you try to think, how does this ever end? It was kind of a fascinating process to observe.
And actually, so just as a note, and we'll come back to this later, but it does sort of raise the question of, if very, very smart people like bankers and very smart lawyers look at a pile of paper and say it's worth 0, and the believers inside say it's worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and then the believers inside who've got you'd argue the closest view on what the patents are and how much they're worth, are then very pleasantly surprised to find out hundreds of millions of dollars starts with a 9. And so you say, oh my God, this is fantastic. And then when the wonders of market competition come into play, that $900 million turns into 2, and then 3, and then $4.5 billion. At any point along the way, that pile of paper could have been sold for almost any number between 0 and $4.5 billion. It just depended on when the music stopped.
So when you talk about Hilco IP Merchant Bank, that part of the whole reason why we're doing this is to be able to trade on our intel on these kind of things. Because when I talk to private equity guys in the city about this whole story, they say, well, when you started at Nortel and they all thought it was worthless, why didn't you offer to pay $200 million and just buy the whole thing? It's like, well, I'm a patent guy. I don't have $200 million, but to a private equity guy, the money's almost irrelevant. If you could structure the deal, we'll find the money. And if I had the connections that I have now, then that would have been a brilliant thing to do, but I just didn't have those kind of connections. So the next Nortel, the next kind of things like this, our view would be that we'll be in the center seat structuring the deal with our connections with the IP owners and the private equity guys to put things together that arbitrage that big gulf, because there's a huge gulf. Most people have no clue about their patents and what potential value they have because they're busy doing other things.
Right. So I want to ask one more question, then I think we'll bring up the next panelist. We'll come back to a lot more of this during the panel discussion. So the music stops, and you're now running a company with a portfolio that was recently valued at $4.5 billion of IP, some of which gets
right. So let's just aggregate that for a minute,
Yeah.
because that's not really well known, but it's the facts. So I'm sure I'm comfortable sharing it. They paid $4.5 billion at the auction. When they did that, they took 2,000 patents off the top that were the wireless ones, and those were allocated to Apple, Microsoft, and BlackBerry, and they also gave themselves licenses. So
licenses to the other 4,000.
to all of the portfolio, to all 6,000.
Okay.
So they put value on the licenses they were getting, and they put value on the patents they were taking off the table, and they said to me, their purchase price allocation as a product of this deal was that the business I was getting had a $1.25 billion market cap. And I said, I can't argue with that. That seems fair. I don't know the details about how you did all the other parts of the purchase price allocation, but that seems like a fair number. And then when you're going to ask, well, we then ended up selling to RPX for $900 million, the $900 million deal with RPX a few years later was in lieu of a $1.5 billion offer I had been able to make to buy it from them as a management buyout. So we had made a 1.25 worth 1.5 over those intervening 3 years. They took $900 million instead because they wanted to see us shut down. And I don't know, I have suspicions as to who and why, but in general you would think as we were doing the right things by the patent portfolio, some of them were getting more and more bad press for being Frankenstein and creating this monster, and it was more important to them to kill the monster than to get the maximum return on their investment.
I see. And so that explains, just so the class knows what we're talking about. By this point, how long was Rockstar in operation before?
3+ years.
3+ years. So during that time, there were a number of efforts made and some successes in trying to monetize the IP portfolio.
Sure.
We've talked earlier about whether IP is a board-level discussion or whether it's typically left to the operating company to manage. This must have been a particularly interesting board to manage. You had Microsoft, Apple, Ericsson.
Well, one of the unfortunate things about the governance is the first 9 months of our 3 years was hampered because the Department of Justice was doing HSR review, and they didn't give us authority to go off and execute until Google was able to buy the Motorola. They gave approval to Google to buy Motorola at the same time they gave us the approval to go ahead and execute. So when that happened, we were freed, but we had DOJ guidelines we had to deal with, and the DOJ didn't allow me to talk to my shareholders, which is my board of directors, about what we were doing. They wanted my shareholders to be kind of in the dark, and most CEOs like Phil lament their lack of autonomy as a CEO, but right away I could see, okay, shit, this is not going to work out well, because I have infinite autonomy, and therefore nobody has my back. And if things work out great, that's great, but how often do they work out great? They very rarely work out great. So yeah, it was more, it wasn't a typical board sort of arrangement, and I'm not sure what more I could say about that.
Yeah, got it. Okay, I think let's stop there for now. Thank you.